My mom yelled, "Get out and never come back," so I packed up and left without arguing. Weeks later, my dad called asking why I stopped helping with the mortgage. I reminded him they told me to leave for good. If I'm not part of the house anymore, my money isn't either. The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and the suffocating weight of a decade's worth of unspoken resentment. I stood there, clutching a bag of organic groceries like a shield, while the 3 lines of a life I had carefully constructed began to fracture under the fluorescent hum of my parents' outdated light fixtures. I had spent 5 years pouring my soul and my salary into the foundation of this house, thinking I was building a safety net, never realizing I was actually weaving a noose. The silence that followed my admission wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of heavy, pressurized stillness that happens right before a storm snaps the oldest oak in the yard. I looked at my mother, Carol, and for a split second, I expected to see relief, or perhaps the softening of a woman who finally understood she didn't have to fight the world alone anymore. Instead, her face underwent a terrifying transformation. The skin around her jaw tightened until it looked like parchment paper stretched over bone, and her eyes, usually clouded with a hazy sort of self-pity, flashed with a predatory, jagged light. She didn't look like a mother who had been saved. She looked like a sovereign who had just discovered a spy in her court. "You've been paying," she whispered, the words whistling through her teeth like steam from a kettle. "For 5 years? You sat at this table, eating the food I cooked, watching us struggle, and you played God with our lives." "Mom, no, that's not it at all," I started, my voice trembling despite the years of professional poise I'd cultivated at Blackwood Consulting. "Dad was laid off. The bank sent a final notice. I didn't want you to lose the roof over your heads. I wanted you to be okay." But there was no okay in this room anymore. My father, Michael, remained frozen in his recliner in the periphery, the blue light of the baseball game flickering across his face like a ghost. He wouldn't look at me. He never looked at the hard things. He had spent years retreating into the upholstery of that chair, becoming a part of the furniture, while I quietly balanced the ledgers that kept that very chair on a floor he no longer owned. "You think you're so much better than us, don't you?" Mom stepped forward, her hand slamming onto the laminate countertop with a crack that made Aunt Patricia jump. "With your high-rise apartment and your designer suits and your senior consultant title, you didn't do this for us. You did this so you could sit there and pity us. You did this so you could feel like the big, powerful success story while we were the charity cases." "It wasn't charity, it was family," I shouted back, the dam finally breaking. "I have spent 60 months, 5 years of my life, transferring thousands of dollars every single month to the bank so you wouldn't end up on the street. I've skipped vacations, I've worked until 2 a.m. to keep my bonuses high enough to cover your debt, and I never asked for a single thank you. I just wanted you to have a home." "A home?" She laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that scraped against my nerves. "This isn't a home if it's bought with your arrogance. You lied to us, Stephanie. You made us believe we were making it on our own. You stripped your father of his dignity, and you did it behind our backs like a thief." Aunt Patricia tried to intervene, her voice small and frantic. "Carol, honey, she was just trying to help." "Anyone would have—" "Shut up, Patricia," Mom barked, not even turning her head. Her focus was locked on me, fueled by a lifetime of feeling inferior to her sister and now, apparently, to her own daughter. "I don't want your money, Stephanie. And I certainly don't want you. You come in here with your grocery bags like you're some kind of saint, looking down your nose at the way we live. If we're such a burden to your perfect, wealthy life, then let us be. We'll figure it out. We don't need a daughter who thinks she can buy our respect." "You aren't figuring it out, Mom. That's the point." I was crying now, the hot tears blurring the side of the kitchen I had spent my childhood in. "The bank was going to take the house. Do you understand? You'd be in a shelter right now if it weren't for those arrogant payments." "Then let them take it," she screamed, her voice reaching a pitch I'd never heard. It was a primal, ugly sound. "I'd rather sleep in the dirt than live another second under your patronage. You're ungrateful for everything we gave you to get you to that fancy school. You're cold, you're calculating, and you're no daughter of mine. Get out. Get out of this house and never come back." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked to my father, hoping for a shred of defense, a single word to stop the madness. He finally turned his head, but his eyes were vacant, filled with a deep, searing shame that he chose to transform into resentment rather than gratitude. He couldn't handle the fact that his daughter had been the man of the house for half a decade. Go on, Stephanie, he said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. You heard your mother. If this is how you feel about us, you should go. I stood there for a long moment, the silence returning, but this time it was different. The weight was gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying clarity. I realized that I had been subsidizing my own emotional abuse. I had been paying for the privilege of being insulted, dismissed, and diminished every Sunday afternoon. I looked at the groceries on the counter, the artisan bread, the expensive wine, the fresh herbs, and I realized they were symbols of a bridge I had been building toward people who were busy burning it from the other side. Fine, I said, my voice suddenly steady, the shaking replaced by a chilling resolve. If that's what you want, that's what you'll get. I'll stop the transfers tonight. I'll call the bank and tell them I'm no longer associated with the loan. You want your independence? You've got it. I hope your pride keeps you warm when the sheriff shows up with the eviction notice. I didn't wait for a response. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, the hook I'd used since I was 16, and walked out. I didn't look back at the yellow siding or the overgrown lawn. I got into my car and drove, the city lights of Boston blurring into long streaks of neon as I headed back to my apartment in Back Bay. The first thing I did when I got home wasn't to cry. I sat at my mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and logged into my banking portal. My fingers didn't hesitate. I canceled the recurring payment to the mortgage lender. I felt a strange, hollow lightness in my chest as I watched this scheduled transaction disappear from the screen. For 5 years, that number had been a permanent fixture of my monthly reality. Now, it was just gone. The next 3 weeks were a blur of high-stakes meetings and hollow nights. I threw myself into my work at Blackwood with a ferocity that concerned even my closest colleagues. I was the first one in and the last one out, burying the image of my mother's contorted face under layers of spreadsheets and market analyses. I blocked their numbers. I had to. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat, a cocktail of hope and dread flooding my system. Was it an apology? Was it a plea for help? It was neither. I heard through Aunt Patricia that the fallout had been immediate. Without my interference, the reality of their financial situation had come crashing down like a house of cards in a gale. They had no savings. My father's occasional consulting gigs barely covered the utilities. The assistance program they thought they were on, the one I had invented to protect their egos, was, in their minds, a failure of the system, not a cessation of my support. One evening, Patricia called me, her voice frantic. Stephanie, they got the letter. The bank is calling in the arrears. Since the program ended, they're demanding the full catch-up or they're starting the process again. Your mother is a wreck, she's blaming the bank, she's blaming the government, but she won't say your name. Good, I said, staring out at the Charles River, the water dark and unforgiving. She told me never to come back. I'm just being an obedient daughter, Pat. But they'll lose everything, Patricia pleaded. Your father, he's just sitting there. He won't even talk. He didn't talk when she threw me out, either, I reminded her. He didn't talk when I spent my 20s making sure they didn't end up on the street. Silence is his specialty. Let him see how it serves him now. It sounds cruel, I know. Sitting in my beautiful apartment with my designer furniture, it sounds like the act of a spoiled child. But people don't understand the slow erosion of the soul that comes from loving people who see your success as a personal insult. I had spent years trying to shrink myself so they wouldn't feel small. I had dimmed my light so they wouldn't feel overshadowed. And the moment I let a single ray of truth shine on the situation, they tried to extinguish me entirely. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 21 days after that dinner. I was in the middle of a presentation for a tech startup when my office door opened. My assistant looked pale. Stephanie, there's a woman in the lobby. She says she's your mother. She's causing a bit of a scene. I felt a cold shiver race down my spine. My mother didn't do scenes in public. She preferred the private, surgical strikes of a dinner table. For her to be at my office, in the heart of the financial district, meant the walls weren't just closing in, they had already collapsed. I walked out to the lobby, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. There she was. Carol Carson, looking smaller and older than I remembered. Her coat was damp from the rain, and she was clutching a tattered manila envelope. The polished, professional environment of Blackwood Consulting made her look incredibly out of place, a relic of a world she had tried to keep me trapped in. She saw me and her face crumpled. Not with anger this time, but with a desperate, naked fear. Stephanie, she rasped, her voice carrying across the quiet lobby. The bank, they're here. They're taking it. You have to do something. You have to fix it. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to jump into the fire to save her. I didn't feel the frantic need to solve the problem. I just felt a profound, echoing exhaustion. I did fix it, Mom, I said quietly, loud enough only for her to hear. I fixed it for 5 years. But you told me I was ungrateful. You told me to get out. You told me my money was an insult to your dignity. I didn't mean it, she sobbed, reaching out to grab my sleeve. Her hands were shaking. I was angry. I was embarrassed. Please, Stephanie. Your father, he can't handle this. Where will we go? I looked at her hand on my expensive blazer, then up at her face. The ungrateful daughter was the only thing standing between her and a moving truck. The irony was so thick it was almost nauseating. I can't fix this one, Mom, I said, and the words felt like a heavy stone being lifted off my chest. Not because I can't afford it, but because if I do, I'll be back in that kitchen, listening to you tell me how I don't understand real life. You wanted to know what real life was like without my interference. Now you know. I turned to my assistant. Please show Mrs. Carson to the elevators. I have a meeting to finish. As I walked back toward the conference room, I heard her calling my name, a haunting, desperate sound. But I didn't stop. I had spent 32 years trying to be the daughter they wanted, and 5 years being the provider they needed. Now, for the first time, I was going to be the woman I actually was. I walked back into that room, sat down at the head of the table, and picked up my pen. The story of Stephanie Carson, the family savior, was over. The story of Stephanie Carson, the woman who finally chose herself, was just beginning. The lobby of my apartment building was a temple of cold marble and hushed luxury, a stark contrast to the man sitting on the velvet bench before me. My father, Michael, looked like a faded photograph of the man I used to know, his skin sallow, his suit jacket hanging off his shrinking frame, and his eyes darting around the room as if the very air of my success was an indictment of his failure. For 5 years, I had been the invisible pillar holding up his world, and now that I'd stepped away, the ceiling was beginning to crack. How does that make any sense, Dad? I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet foyer. You're asking me to continue being the ghost in the machine. You want me to keep wiring thousands of dollars every month to a home where my own mother told me I was no longer welcome. Do you hear how insane that sounds? He winced, the sound of his own reality being read back to him clearly causing him physical pain. Stephanie, she was emotional. You know how your mother gets when she feels cornered. She's always had a prideful streak, and finding out you'd been carrying us, it made her feel small. She lashed out. She didn't just lash out, Dad. She performed a surgical strike on our relationship, I countered, leaning forward. She called me ungrateful. She said I was playing savior just to feel superior. And you? You sat there. You watched the woman who has kept you from a homeless shelter for 60 months get gutted like a fish, and you didn't say a word until the door was already closing behind me. I was in shock, he pleaded, his hands trembling. I didn't even know about the payments. I thought the bank's assistance program was real. I thought we were finally catching a break from the universe, not from our daughter's paycheck. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? I felt a stray tear escape, but I wiped it away with a practiced, cold efficiency. The fact that you'd rather believe in a miraculous bank program than in the possibility that your daughter loved you enough to sacrifice her own future for yours. I delayed buying my own condo for years because that $1,875 a month was my down payment fund. I've lived in a rental so you could keep a 3-bedroom house you don't even use. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization of what those numbers actually meant. $112,500. That was the price of my loyalty. That was the cost of the charity my mother so despised. The bank, they're not playing, Stephanie, Dad whispered, his voice cracking. They sent a representative. If we don't bring the account current by the end of the month, the foreclosure becomes official. We'll have 90 days. Your mother, she's barely eating. She spends all day looking at old photo albums, crying. She won't admit she's wrong, but she's dying inside. Then let her tell me that, I said, my heart hardening. If she's the one who threw me out, she's the one who needs to invite me back. And I don't mean a text message demanding I fix this. I mean an actual, human apology. She'll never do it, Dad said, his shoulders slumping. You know her. She'd rather lose the house than lose face. Then she's already made her choice, hasn't she? I stood up, the movement final. She's choosing her pride over her home. And if you're choosing to stay silent while she does it, then you're choosing her pride, too. I'm not a bank, Dad. I'm your daughter. And if you can't see the difference, then I can't help you. I walked him to the door, the automatic glass panels sliding open to let in the humid Boston air. I watched him walk toward the subway station, a man who had spent his life avoiding the wind, now finally being forced to stand in the gale. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my balcony, watching the lights of the city and thinking about the $1,875 that was still sitting in my savings account this month. For the first time, it felt like my money. Not a debt, not a bribe for my mother's love, but my own labor, translated into currency. The next few days were an escalation of desperation. My mother's texts changed from demands to guilt trips. I hope you're happy in your fancy tower while your father packs boxes, she wrote. Then, your brother Ryan won't even answer the phone. I guess you've turned him against us too. I hope the money was worth your soul. I didn't engage. I was working with Dr. Matthews, my therapist, on holding the line. She told me that for people like my mother, boundaries feel like personal attacks because they've spent a lifetime treating people like extensions of themselves. To Carol, I wasn't a person, I was a resource. And when a resource stops flowing, the owner gets angry. But then, on a Thursday evening, the tone shifted. I received a voicemail. It wasn't from my mother or my father. It was from the dental office where my mother had worked for 15 years. Stephanie, this is Dr. Eris. I'm calling because your mother had a collapse at the front desk today. Her blood pressure spiked, and she's been taken to Mass General. We couldn't get a hold of your father. Please call us back. The world tilted. The line I had been holding suddenly felt like a tightrope over an abyss. Regardless of the mortgage, regardless of the insults, the primal lizard brain part of me screamed, "That's your mother." I was at the hospital in 20 minutes. The ER was a chaotic symphony of beeps and shouting, but I found her in a small curtained cubicle. She looked tiny. Without the armor of her anger, she looked like a crumpled piece of paper. Her eyes were closed, and there were tubes tethered to her arms. My father was there, sitting in a plastic chair, looking utterly defeated. The doctors say it was a hypertensive crisis, Dad whispered, not looking up. Stress. The letters, the bank, she hasn't slept in a week, Steph. She's been up all night cleaning the house, as if she could scrub the debt away. I walked to the side of the bed and tentatively reached for her hand. Her skin was cool and thin. For a moment, the anger vanished, replaced by a hollow, aching grief for the relationship we never had. I wanted to tell her I was sorry. I wanted to tell her I'd pay the $110,000 all over again just to see her smile without a twist of bitterness. Then, her eyes fluttered open. She saw me, and for a heartbeat, there was a flicker of something soft. But as the fog of the medication cleared, the familiar hardness returned to her gaze. She pulled her hand away from mine. Did you come to see the ruins? She rasped, her voice dry. I came because I was worried about you, Mom, I said, my heart sinking. Worried, she spat the word out like it was bitter. You're only here because you want to be the one to save the day again. You want me to thank you now, don't you? On my deathbed, you want your trophy. Carol, stop it, Dad pleaded, but his voice lacked conviction. I don't want a trophy, Mom, I said, standing up. The pity I'd felt moments ago was being rapidly replaced by a cold, clear-eyed realization. Even at her lowest point, her first instinct was to sharpen her tongue. I wanted to make sure you weren't dying. You aren't. Your blood pressure is high because you've spent your whole life feeding on resentment instead of love. Get out, she whispered, turning her head toward the wall. I don't need your pity. I don't need your money. Just let us lose the house. Let us be free of you. I looked at my father. Are you going to let her say that? Again? In a hospital. Dad looked from me to her, his jaw working. He looked like a man standing between two fires, and he chose the one that provided the most familiar warmth. Maybe you should go, Stephanie. You're just upsetting her. I didn't cry this time. I walked out of the ER, through the sliding glass doors, and into the cool night air. I realized then that there was no saving them. You can't save people who are more committed to their own misery than to their own survival. I had been paying for a house, but I had been trying to buy a family. And the truth was that family didn't exist. I drove home in total silence. No radio, no podcasts. Just the sound of the tires on the pavement. When I got to my apartment, I didn't go to my office. I went to my bedroom, packed a suitcase, and booked a flight to Seattle. The next morning, I sent one final email. Not to my parents, but to the bank manager I had dealt with for 5 years. Dear Mr. Henderson, I am officially withdrawing my support for the loan associated with the Carson property. Please proceed with the standard foreclosure protocols. Do not contact me regarding future payments. My involvement in this matter is concluded. I hit send as the plane's engines began to roar. As we lifted off over the Atlantic, watching the coast of Massachusetts shrink into a jagged line of blue and gray, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't the exhilaration I'd expected. It was more like the feeling after a long fever breaks. I was weak, I was tired, but I was finally clean. I spent 2 weeks in Seattle with Ryan. We hiked through the Olympic National Forest, the air smelling of pine and damp earth. We talked about our childhood, not the version our mother told, but the real one. We talked about the way Dad used to disappear into his books to avoid the shouting, and how Ryan had learned to be invisible so he wouldn't be the target. You were the only one who tried to fix it, Steph, Ryan told me one night as we sat on his deck, looking out at the Space Needle. The rest of us just tried to survive it. You thought if you worked hard enough and earned enough, you could rewrite the script. But some stories are already finished. You were just trying to add extra chapters to a book that was already closed. He was right. I had been the editor of a tragedy, trying to turn it into a Hallmark movie through sheer financial force. While I was away, the inevitable happened. The foreclosure notice was posted on the front door of the house in Riverside. Aunt Patricia called me, crying, telling me that the neighbors were gossiping and that my mother had locked herself in the bedroom. They have to move, Stephanie, Patricia sobbed. They found a small apartment near the dentist's office, but it's a basement unit. It's tiny. Carol says she'll never forgive you. She already didn't forgive me, Pat, I said, watching a ferry cross the Puget Sound. She didn't forgive me for being successful, she didn't forgive me for helping, and she didn't forgive me for existing. Her forgiveness isn't the currency I'm trading in anymore. When I returned to Boston, I was different. My walk was slower, my voice quieter. I stopped staying late at the office. I started taking a pottery class. I even went on a date with a man who didn't care about my job title and who thought my family drama was something to be managed, not a burden to be carried. One afternoon, a month after the move, I found myself driving through Riverside. I didn't mean to, but my car seemed to find the way on autopilot. I pulled up in front of the old house. The for sale sign was staked into the lawn I used to pay a neighbor's kid to mow. The flower beds I'd paid to have mulched were starting to grow weeds. The house looked smaller than I remembered. It looked like just a building. For walls, a roof, and a lot of bad memories. I saw a moving truck pulling away from the curb. My parents were gone. They were in their basement apartment now, living the life their actual income provided. It was a hard life, a real life, exactly the one my mother had accused me of not understanding. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from my father. We're settled in. It's small, but we're managing. Your mother is. She's quiet. She asks if you've called. I think she's waiting for you to find us. I think she's waiting for you to say you're sorry so she can feel like she won. I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought about the thousands of dollars, the hundreds of Sundays, the decades of trying to be enough. I thought about the girl who used to tutor underclassmen so her parents could pay the electric bill. I whispered a silent thank you to that girl. She had been so brave and so kind. But she was gone now. I didn't type a long response. I didn't explain or argue or vent. I simply typed, I'm glad you're settled. I won't be coming by. Take care of yourselves. I put the car in gear and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 32 years, the road ahead of me was wide open, and for the first time, I wasn't paying anyone else's toll to drive on it. I was Stephanie Carson, and I was finally going home, to a home that belonged to me and me alone. The heavy, double-locked door of my childhood home felt like a portal into a past I was finally ready to bury. When my father, Michael, opened it, the relief on his face was so palpable it was almost pathetic. A man who had spent his life drowning in silence, finally gasping for air because his daughter had agreed to a meeting. Your mother's in the living room, he whispered, as if he were a guide leading me into a lion's den. I stepped inside, the familiar, cloying scent of Mom's floral perfume and the sharp lemon polish Dad used to mask the smell of age and decay hitting me like a physical wave. For a split second, the nostalgia threatened to pull me under, whispering of Sunday roasts and the girl I used to be, but I gripped my purse and stood taller. This wasn't a social call, this was a negotiation of my soul. The living room felt like a stage set for a tragedy that had already closed. Mom sat on the edge of the floral couch, her spine a rigid line of defiance, her face a mask of carefully curated stoicism. Dad sat beside her, leaving me the velvet armchair that had always been mine. The coffee table between us, cluttered with coasters and old magazines, felt like a demilitarized zone where the next word spoken could either trigger a peace treaty or a final declaration of war. "Thank you for coming," Dad began, his voice cracking slightly as he followed the script he'd clearly been practicing for days. "We appreciate you being willing to talk." I didn't answer. I didn't want to make this easy. I waited for the silence to stretch, for the hum of the refrigerator to become deafening, until my mother finally broke. She cleared her throat, not looking at me, but at the wall behind my head. "The bank called again yesterday. They're moving forward with foreclosure. The proceedings are official." "No, I'm sorry. No, I was wrong. Just the ledger. Just the debt." I felt a cold, familiar disappointment settle in my gut. "Is that all you have to say to me, Mom? You haven't seen me in weeks, you threw me out of this house, and the first thing you want to talk about is the interest rate." Her eyes flashed with that jagged, defensive light. "Well, what do you want, Stephanie? You want me to grovel? You want me to beg?" Dad placed a steadying hand on her arm, a silent command for her to stop. She faltered, her jaw working as she fought the internal war between her pride and her survival. Finally, she looked at me, and her voice was a degree softer. I may have overreacted that day." "May have?" I echoed, my voice flat. "I did overreact," she amended, the words sounding like they were being pulled from her throat with pliers. "I shouldn't have told you to leave." "Why did you do it then?" I asked, leaning forward, refusing to let her hide behind vague generalities. "Why was get out the first thing you said when you found out I'd been saving your lives for 5 years?" She shifted uncomfortably, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "I was humiliated. Finding out that you'd been paying for the very air we breathe, and in front of Patricia. You know how she looks at me. Like I'm some charity case she needs to pity. To realize my own daughter was the one holding the strings, it made me feel like a failure in my own home. It was the most honest thing she'd ever said, and it was devastating. It wasn't about the money, it was about the image. Her pride was a fortress she would rather burn down than surrender. "So, your pride was worth more than 30 years of being my mother," I said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. "It wasn't like that," she started, but Dad interrupted her with a firmness that nearly knocked me off my chair. "Yes, it was, Carol," he said, looking her in the eye. "That's exactly what it was. Our pride led us to take advantage of her for years. We let her carry us while we sat here and criticized her for working too hard. We were cowards." The room went still. Mom's lips thinned into a white line, but for the first time in my life, she didn't bark back. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I slid it across the coffee table toward them. Inside were 5 years of bank statements, every transfer highlighted in yellow. $112,500, I said, my voice steady. "That is the cost of my arrogance. Every payment made on time, while I sat at this table and listened to you tell me I didn't understand real life. You accepted the help without asking, and you hated me for it while you spent it." Dad picked up the folder, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. "I had no idea. I thought the bank was being kind. I didn't know it was you, Steph. Not all of it. Because you didn't want to know," I said. "It was easier to believe in a miracle than to thank your daughter." Mom stared at the yellow highlights, and for the first time, her mask cracked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say. Try thank you," I suggested. "And then try a real apology for the things you said when you told me I wasn't your daughter anymore." She flinched. The silence hung heavy until she finally looked up, her eyes wet. "Thank you, Stephanie. And I'm sorry. I was jealous. Watching you build this life, afford the things we never could, it made me feel like everything we did was for nothing. It was easier to be angry than to be grateful." The raw honesty of that admission was the first brick of a new foundation. We spent the next hour dismantling the old one. I told them the terms. I was not resuming the mortgage. The $1,875 a month was over. Instead, I would help them downsize. I would help them find a life they could actually afford. I told them there would be no more comments about my career, no more passive-aggressive jabs about my life in the city, and that Sunday dinners were now a monthly privilege, not a weekly chore. I am your daughter, I told them as I stood to leave. Not your bank. Not your emotional punching bag. If you can't respect the person I've become, then you don't get the daughter you had. To my shock, Mom looked at me with a strange sense of wonder. You've become a very strong woman, Stephanie. I don't know if I would have had the courage to say those things to my own mother. It was as close to a blessing as I was ever going to get. The months that followed were a whirlwind of spreadsheets and cardboard boxes. We found a 2-bedroom condo 20 minutes away. It was bright, it was modern, and most importantly, it was affordable. Moving day was a funeral for the past. I found Mom standing in the empty living room of the Riverside house, staring at the spot where I took my first steps 32 years ago. It's just a house, Mom, I said, putting an arm around her. I know, she whispered, leaning into me for the first time in a decade. The memories come with us. And maybe, in the new place, we can make better ones. 6 months later, the transformation is something I still struggle to believe. My parents are living within their means in their sun-drenched condo. Dad has taken over the finances, proudly showing me his budget every month like a kid with a gold star. He's found a voice he'd suppressed for 40 years. Mom is still Mom. She still bites her tongue sometimes when she wants to complain, but she's trying. She asks about my work. She listens. She treats me like an adult. My relationship with my brother, Ryan, has healed too. He visited for the first time in years last month. We sat on the balcony of their new place, eating Chinese food, and for the first time, we didn't feel like we were waiting for a bomb to go off. They're actually okay, he whispered to me. No, I replied, watching my father laugh at something my mother said. They're just real now. No more secrets, no more lies. Professionally, I've been promoted to executive consultant. Without the weight of my parents' debt on my shoulders, my work has reached new heights. Personally, I'm seeing a man named James who understands that my boundaries aren't walls, they're the gates that keep the right people in and the wrong ones out. I've learned that the greatest act of love isn't sacrifice, it's truth. By stopping the payments, I didn't lose my family. I forced them to grow. I stopped being a martyr and started being a daughter. The mortgage is gone, the house is sold, but for the first time in my life, I finally feel like I've come home. I am Stephanie Carson, and I am no longer paying the price for a love that should have always been free.